July 1613. Ipatiev Monastery. The air inside the cramped stone cell is thick with the scent of beeswax, old wood, and a damp, penetrating chill that has nothing to do with the summer heat outside. It is the smell of fear. A 16-year-old boy, Mikhail Fyodorovich Romanov, stands cloaked in the simple, dark garb of a nobleman living in forced seclusion, his face pale and elongated, dominated by large, apprehensive eyes. Before him, his mother, the great nun Marfa, a formidable woman whose piety is a shield of tempered steel, stands rigid, her knuckles white as she clutches her prayer rope. The sounds from the courtyard are a terrifying symphony of chaos and order. There is the rhythmic tramp of armed men, the clink of chainmail, the snorting of exhausted horses, but above it all, a low, persistent hum, the sound of a great multitude holding its collective breath. An embassy from the Zemsky Sobor, the Council of the Land, has arrived from the smoldering ruins of Moscow, and they have brought with them the most terrifying object in all of Muscovy, the crown. When the boyar, Fyodor Sheremetev, a man whose face is a roadmap of the kingdom's suffering, finally enters and falls to his knees. The weight of his words fills the small room, sucking the very air from it. He speaks of a land bled dry, of Polish and Swedish predators tearing at the borders, of Cossack warlords ruling the highways, of fields sown with bones instead of wheat. He speaks of the urgent need for a legitimate, God-given Tsar to end the godless chaos of the time of troubles. And then he offers the throne of Monomach, the crown of Ivan the Terrible, to this boy. Young Michael does not see a glittering prize. He sees a poisoned chalice, a death sentence. He weeps, he refuses, pleading his youth and inexperience. His mother echoes his refusal, her voice ringing with the memory of what happened to previous czars, how they were murdered, overthrown, and cursed. This is not a glorious annunciation. It is a moment of pure, unadulterated terror. The boy is not being offered power. He is being offered up as a sacrifice, a fragile symbol to be placed on a crumbling altar in the desperate hope that his blood, the blood distantly related to the old Rurikid line, might somehow appease the wrathful god who has abandoned their land. This is the narrative of him, the quiet boy who ascended a throne of skulls and ashes. This was the saga of a dynasty, born not of ambition, but of exhaustion and terror. To understand this man and the 300-year epic he unwillingly began, we must return to the world that chose him, a world that had forgotten the very meaning of order. The central burning paradox of Michael Romanov's life is how this gentle, politically invisible youth, a pawn in the brutal games of powerful boyar clans and foreign invaders, a figure selected precisely because he was deemed harmless and controllable, managed not only to survive, but to become the bedrock of a new Russia. How did the chosen victim become the founder? Was it the strength of his character, hidden beneath a veneer of meekness? Was it the shrewd guidance of his imprisoned father? Or was it something larger, an unconscious, collective will of a nation so shattered that it could only be healed by the one thing it had left? The idea of a pure, legitimate sovereign, a role that only this terrified boy could fill. The entire history of the Romanovs, with all its glory and all its horror, begins here, not with a roar of triumph, but with the terrified sobs of a 16-year-old in a provincial monastery, being forced to accept a crown that everyone else who had touched it in the past 15 years had paid for with their life. His story is the ultimate answer to the question of who, or what, truly saved Russia from complete annihilation. To understand the terror in that monastery cell, we must zoom out and behold the corpse of a kingdom upon which vultures were feasting. In the year 1613, Muscovy was not a state. It was a geographical expression, a power vacuum, a black hole of anarchy that was sucking in predators from every direction. This was the world on the brink. In the West, the great power of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, under its ambitious and fanatically Catholic king Sigismund III Vasa, was not merely an enemy, it was a claimant to the entire Russian throne. Polish garrisons still occupied the mighty fortress of Smolensk, the key to Moscow, a dagger pointed at the heart of the land. Polish-backed pretenders and rogue nobles considered the Russian lands their personal fiefdom. To the northwest, the Kingdom of Sweden, a rising military power, had seized the ancient and wealthy city of Novgorod, effectively controlling all trade routes to the Baltic and methodically carving off chunks of Russian territory. Its king, Gustavus Adolphus, was already dreaming of turning the Gulf of Finland into a Swedish lake. To the south lay the wild field, the vast steppe that was not a border, but a bleeding open wound. From there, the Crimean Khanate, a vassal of the mighty Ottoman Empire, launched its devastating annual raids. These were not wars of conquest, but horrific slave hunts. Every year, tens of thousands of men, women, and children were herded south in chains to be sold in the markets of Kaffa, bleeding the demographic lifeblood from the southern principalities. The Ottoman Sultan in Constantinople watched this chaos with keen interest, seeing Muscovy's collapse as an opportunity to solidify his dominance over the entire Black Sea region. Internally, the situation was even more apocalyptic. The country was crawling with warlords, remnants of the various armies that had fought during the time of troubles. The most powerful among them were the Don Cossacks, a volatile, anarchic military force that had been instrumental in driving the Poles from Moscow, but now recognized no authority, living by plunder and threatening to march on the capital if their demands were not met. The land was ravaged by famine and plague, with some estimates suggesting that up to a third of the population had perished in the preceding 15 years. This was the inheritance offered to Michael Romanov, a phantom crown for a phantom kingdom, a land surrounded by powerful, rapacious enemies, and consumed from within by a cancer of lawlessness. The name Romanov itself was both a blessing and a curse, a faint echo of legitimacy in a world that had none. This was the legacy of a Tsar's blood. The family's claim to prominence was slender, but vital. The first and most beloved wife of Ivan the Terrible, Anastasia Romanovna, had been one of their own. This connection to the divinely ordained Rurikid dynasty, which had ruled for 700 years before its calamitous end in 1598, made the Romanovs objects of both reverence and suspicion. It was this kinship that had elevated Michael's grandfather, Nikita, to a position of great influence, and it was this same kinship that brought the wrath of the new Tsar, Boris Godunov, down upon them. Godunov, a man of immense talent, but lacking the aura of ancient legitimacy, saw the Romanovs as his most dangerous rivals. This led to the forging of Michael's character in the crucible of fear. As a young boy, he witnessed his father, the brilliant and ambitious Fyodor Romanov, forcibly tonsured as a monk under the name Filaret and exiled to a remote monastery. His uncles were exiled, killed, or disappeared into the dungeons of the new regime. Michael himself, along with his mother and sister, was sent into a harsh exile in the Beluzero region, living under constant surveillance, their lives hanging by a thread. This childhood did not teach him statecraft or military strategy. It taught him silence, caution, and a deep, abiding piety. He learned to hide his thoughts, to trust no one outside his immediate family, and to see the hand of God in both suffering and survival. While other noble youths were learning the art of war and intrigue at court, Michael was learning the Psalms and the art of staying alive in a world where a single careless word could lead to destruction. This was not the education of a ruler, but of a survivor, and it was this very quality, this lack of overt ambition, this quiet endurance, that would, ironically, make him the only acceptable candidate for the throne. He had been forged not for power, but for sacrifice. The first step into the great game was not a bold stride, but a hesitant shuffle, pushed from behind by forces far beyond his control. The Zemsky Sobor that convened in Moscow in early 1613 was not the noble assembly of national unity that later chroniclers would portray. It was a snake pit of competing interests, a desperate gamble by a ruined elite. To understand the election of the meekest, one must feel the atmosphere in the city. Moscow was a landscape of ruins, its wooden structures largely turned to ash, its great Kremlin scarred by the recent Polish occupation. The Boyar clans, the Schwiskys, the Golitsins, the Mstislavskys, who had spent the last decade murdering, betraying, and overthrowing one another, were now politically and financially exhausted. They eyed each other with a paranoia born of bitter experience, each knowing that the elevation of a rival clan leader would mean their own doom. Into this deadlock rode the representatives of the service nobility, and crucially, a large, armed, and unruly delegation of Cossacks. It was these Cossacks, led by Prince Dmitry Trubetskoy, who had been the backbone of the national militia that retook Moscow, and they now demanded a say in the choice of a new Tsar. They rejected the old, powerful boyars, whom they blamed for the country's woes. They also rejected foreign candidates, like the Polish Prince Władysław or a Swedish duke, their patriotism having been ignited by the horrors of foreign occupation. In this volatile marketplace of fear and ambition, the name of Michael Romanov emerged as the ultimate compromise. He was a boyar, but from a family that had been persecuted, not one of the ruling clique. He possessed the precious drop of Rurikid blood through his great-aunt Anastasia. He was young, suggesting he could be easily molded. And most importantly, he was absent, living quietly in a monastery far from Moscow's intrigues, and his powerful father was a prisoner in Poland. He threatened no one. The final decision, according to some chronicles, was swayed by the impassioned cry of a Cossack leader who declared that Michael, son of the long-suffering Filaret, was the candidate closest to the old dynasty and most pleasing to God. His election was not a triumph of his own merit, but a testament to the utter bankruptcy of all other options. He was chosen not to rule, but to reign, not to lead, but to symbolize a new beginning. Beneath the veneer of pious meekness, the inner world of the young Tsar was a landscape of profound spiritual terror and responsibility. His primary motivation was not a thirst for power, which he had never known and had been taught to fear, but an overwhelming sense of divine burden, a belief that he was a chosen vessel for his nation's suffering and potential salvation. This was the fear of God and the ghost of Dmitri. For a young man raised in the intensely religious culture of 17th century Muscovy, the crown was not a political tool, but a sacred cross to be borne. The calamities of the time of troubles were universally seen as God's punishment for the nation's sins, beginning with the alleged murder of the true heir, Tsarevich Dmitri, in Uglish in 1591. The ghost of that murdered child had haunted Russia for 2 decades, incarnating in a series of terrifyingly successful impostors who claimed his name and tore the country apart. Michael, more than anyone, understood that his legitimacy was fragile, and that the slightest misstep, the slightest deviation from the path of righteousness, could provoke God's wrath anew and plunge the kingdom back into chaos. His inner demon was not ambition or greed, but a paralyzing fear of failure. He was haunted by the fates of Boris Godunov, who died in agony as his kingdom crumbled, and Vasily Świecki, who was deposed and died in a Polish prison. Every decision was weighed against this apocalyptic backdrop. His piety was not a political performance. It was the core of his identity and his primary survival mechanism. He spent hours in prayer, made frequent pilgrimages, and deferred constantly to the authority of the Orthodox Church. This deep religiosity was his shield and his guide, a way of managing the crushing psychological weight of his position. He genuinely believed that if he lived a righteous life and submitted to God's will, God would save his kingdom. This transformed his political weakness into a source of spiritual strength and, crucially, made him deeply relatable to his people, who shared his belief that only a return to holy tradition could heal their land. In the perilous early years of his reign, Michael's survival depended entirely on the alliances he could muster, yet his most powerful ally was 1,000 kilometers away, languishing in a Polish Catholic monastery. This was the fateful alliance forged in a prison cell. The relationship between Michael and his absent father, Filaret, was the central pillar of the new regime. Filaret, the brilliant, ruthless, and politically astute former boyar, was the true architect of the Romanovs' rise. From his captivity, he managed to send messages and advice, a guiding hand from beyond the border. His very existence as a martyr in Polish hands served as a powerful propaganda tool for the new dynasty, a symbol of national suffering and resistance. Michael's deference to his father was absolute. He was not just a son obeying his father, but a junior ruler awaiting the return of his senior partner. This strange dynamic shaped the entire political structure of the era. Alongside this paternal bond was the immediate and powerful influence of his mother, the nun Marfa. Having survived the purges and exiles, she was a woman of immense fortitude and political cunning. In the early years, she was the power behind the throne, vetting Michael's advisors, controlling access to the young Tsar, and ensuring the interests of the Romanov clan were paramount. But beyond this family circle, the most crucial and unconventional alliance was with the Zemsky Sobor itself. This council of the land, an assembly of clergy, boyars, service nobility, and even merchants, was the very body that had elected him. In the first decade of his reign, it met almost continuously, functioning as a de facto parliament. For Michael, it was both a necessity and a shield. Lacking the experience and authority to rule alone, he relied on the Sobor to approve taxes, to raise armies, and to make major policy decisions. This diffused responsibility. When unpopular taxes were levied or difficult treaties signed, it was not the act of a lone autocrat, but the collective will of the land. This symbiotic relationship was a radical departure from the autocratic traditions of Ivan the Terrible, born entirely of the weakness of the crown. Michael could not command, so he had to build consensus. This forced collaboration, this reliance on the collective wisdom of the realm, became the surprising formula for the state's initial survival. The journey from the Ipatiev monastery to Moscow in the summer of 1613 was not a triumphant royal procession. It was a slow, terrifying crawl through a circle of hell, a brutal education in the reality of the kingdom he had inherited. This was the first price of power. The land itself was a ruin. The delegation traveled through deserted villages, past fields choked with weeds and reclaimed by forest, the signs of massacre and famine etched into the landscape. Instead of cheering crowds, they were met by gaunt-faced peasants who looked upon them with a mixture of desperate hope and profound suspicion. The country was swarming with armed bands, remnants of Polish armies, rogue Cossack units, and simple peasant bandits, making every league of the journey a mortal risk. The royal procession had to be heavily guarded, moving like a military column through hostile territory. This first-hand view of the abyss had a profound impact on the young Tsar. The abstract concept of a ruined kingdom became a sensory reality. The smell of cold campfires, the sight of unburied bones, the eerie silence of once thriving towns. Upon finally reaching Moscow, his first acts were not those of a mighty sovereign, but of a desperate crisis manager. The treasury was empty, not just low on funds, but literally empty. The state had ceased to function. His first decree was a heart-rending appeal to the great monasteries and the wealthy Stroganov merchant family, begging them for loans to simply pay the soldiers guarding the Kremlin walls. His second task was to deal with the very Cossacks who had helped elect him. One of their most notorious adamants, Ivan Zarutsky, who had been the lover of the pretender, false Dmitry II's widow, Marina Mniszek, and who held her young son, dubbed the Little Felon, was leading a major rebellion in the south, proposing a new candidate for the throne. Michael's government had to use its first borrowed funds to raise an army to hunt him down. Zarutsky was eventually captured and impaled in Moscow, and the 3-year-old boy, a potential rival claimant, was publicly hanged, an act of brutal necessity that stained the beginning of the gentle Tsar's reign. This was the grim reality of power, not grand pronouncements, but a desperate scramble for money, the ruthless elimination of rivals, and the daily struggle to feed a starving capital. Looming over the shattered realm of Muscovy was the shadow of its great western adversary, a powerful and confident state, with a king who viewed Michael's election as a personal insult and a strategic opportunity. This was the Polish wolf and its Catholic dream. The Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth in the early 17th century was one of the largest and most formidable powers in Europe. It was an aristocratic republic led by an elected monarch, and its current king, Sigismund III Vasa, was a man of immense ambition and unshakable ideological conviction. A devout Catholic and a member of the Swedish Vasa dynasty, Sigismund dreamed of a grand Catholic empire in Eastern Europe, uniting Poland, Lithuania, Muscovy, and his native Sweden under his rule, creating a bulwark against both the Protestant heresy in the north and the Orthodox schism in the east. He did not see Russia as a sovereign equal, but as a failed state, a missionary territory ripe for both political domination and religious conversion. His perspective was shaped by years of Russian chaos, which he had actively fueled. He had backed the first false Dmitry, then invaded directly, and had succeeded in placing his son, Prince Władysław, on the Moscow throne in 1610, an act ratified by a group of collaborationist boyars. From Sigismund's point of view, the Zemsky Sobor of 1613 and the election of Michael Romanov was an illegal rebellion, the work of treacherous subjects reneging on their lawful oath to his son. He refused to recognize Michael as Tsar, continuing to style Władysław as the rightful ruler of Muscovy. This was not mere political posturing. It had profound strategic implications. It meant that Poland was in a de facto state of war with the new Russian government. Polish control of the strategic fortress of Smolensk gave them a permanent military advantage, a gateway for future invasions. Furthermore, Sigismund held the ultimate trump card, Michael's father, Filaret, who was his prisoner. This personal leverage over the new Tsar's family, combined with his unshakable belief in his son's claim, made Sigismund the single greatest threat to the Romanov dynasty's survival. The conflict was thus not just a territorial dispute, it was an ideological and dynastic war for the very soul of Eastern Europe. After nearly 2 decades of survival and slow, painful consolidation, the Romanov state, now jointly ruled by Michael and his returned father, Patriarch Filaret, felt strong enough to avenge the humiliations of the past. The result was a military catastrophe that brutally reset their ambitions and taught them a lesson in the new realities of European warfare. This was the humiliation at Smolensk. The casus belli was the death of King Sigismund III in 1632 and the subsequent period of political uncertainty in Poland. Filaret, the true architect of Russian foreign policy, saw this as a golden opportunity to reclaim the fortress city of Smolensk, the jewel that had been lost during the time of troubles. He had spent years rebuilding the army, pouring the state's meager resources into it, and he was convinced the time for revenge had come. A large Russian army, numbering over 30,000 men and equipped with impressive new siege artillery, cast with the help of Dutch engineers, was dispatched under the command of Boyar Mikhail Schein, the very man who had heroically but unsuccessfully defended Smolensk against the Poles 2 decades earlier. Initially, the campaign went well. The Russians surrounded Smolensk and began a protracted siege. However, the fundamental weaknesses of the Muscovite state soon became apparent. The army was a clumsy mix of old gentry cavalry and new mercenary regiments of the New Order, plagued by internal rivalries and logistical nightmares. The siege dragged on for months, and Schein proved to be an indecisive and overly cautious commander. Then, the newly elected Polish king, Władysław IV, a gifted military commander, arrived with a relief army. In a series of brilliant maneuvers, he outflanked the Russian forces, cut their supply lines, and trapped the besiegers in their own camps. Starvation and disease set in, and the Russian army, which had set out with such high hopes, disintegrated. In 1634, Schein was forced into a dishonorable surrender. He was allowed to march his remaining troops away, but only after leaving behind all his artillery and banners in disgrace. The news of the defeat was a devastating blow to Moscow's prestige. Filaret, who had pushed for the war, had died during the siege, but the blame fell squarely on the commander, Schein, who was summarily tried and executed along with his deputies. The Smolensk War was more than a military defeat. It was a psychological breaking point. It taught the Romanovs that patriotic zeal and sheer numbers were no match for modern European military tactics and leadership. It forced them to recognize the long and arduous path they still had to travel to achieve military parity with their Western neighbors, a lesson that would shape Russian policy for the rest of the century. In a world defined by weakness and external threats, the new Romanov government discovered the most potent tool for state building: the perpetual fear of a return to chaos. This was the process of forging a state from fear. The memory of the time of troubles, or the smuta, was a raw, gaping wound in the national psyche. It was a time when the social order had completely collapsed, when son turned against father, when villages were burned by roving gangs, and when foreign armies occupied the sacred heart of the kingdom. The government of Michael Romanov, and later the diarchy with his father Filaret, masterfully harnessed this collective trauma to justify a program of relentless and often brutal state centralization. Every new tax, every military levy, every encroachment on old privileges was presented not as a power grab, but as a necessary measure to prevent the return of the smuta. This logic was difficult to refute. When the service nobility complained about extended military campaigns on the southern frontier, they were reminded of the Polish presence in the Kremlin. When merchants balked at new duties, they were reminded of the economic collapse that had left the markets barren. The constant threat of new pretenders, a very real danger in a populace conditioned to believe in miraculously surviving princes, was used to justify the creation of a more effective internal security apparatus. This atmosphere of perpetual crisis enabled the government to push through fundamental reforms that would have been unthinkable in more stable times. The bureaucracy was dramatically expanded through the system of prikazy, or administrative departments, which extended the Tsar's reach into every aspect of life, from military affairs to judicial matters. The tax system was overhauled to be more efficient and extractive, ensuring a steady, if small, flow of revenue to the state. Crucially, the government began to rely heavily on foreign expertise, welcoming European military officers, engineers, and doctors, overcoming traditional xenophobia with the pragmatic argument that their skills were essential for survival. In essence, the regime's message was simple. The old, decentralized, boyar-dominated system led to chaos. Only a strong, centralized autocracy, with the Tsar at its undisputed head, could guarantee order. Thus, the very chaos that had brought Michael to power became the anvil upon which the new, powerful Russian state was hammered into shape. The single greatest triumph of Michael's reign was not a battle won, but a prisoner's return. The Truce of Dulino, signed with Poland in 1619, was, on paper, a national humiliation. It confirmed the loss of Smolensk and other vast Western territories for another generation. Yet, it achieved one overriding objective that outweighed all the territorial losses. It secured the release and return of Michael's father, Filaret, from more than 8 years of Polish captivity. This was the father's return, the son's triumph. The scene of their reunion in Moscow was a moment of profound political theater and genuine emotion. The young Tsar, now 23 years old, and a ruler in his own right for 6 years, rode out of the capital to meet the procession bringing his long-lost father home. He dismounted and bowed to the ground before Filaret, not just as a son before a father, but as a ruler before his spiritual and political superior. Filaret, who had been elevated to the position of Patriarch of Moscow while still in absentia, now returned to claim his role. An extraordinary system of dual power, a diarchy, was immediately established. Filaret was officially granted the title of Great Sovereign, a title previously reserved for the Tsar alone. From that moment until his death in 1633, he was the effective ruler of Russia. All state documents were issued in the names of both the Tsar and the Patriarch. Foreign ambassadors presented their credentials to both. Michael sat on his throne, the embodiment of sacred, hereditary legitimacy, while Filaret sat on the patriarchal throne beside him, wielding the real administrative and political power. This unique arrangement was a stroke of political genius. It solved the problem of Michael's youth and inexperience without undermining his position. It brought Filaret's sharp intellect, iron will, and deep understanding of statecraft to the helm of the government. Under his guidance, the process of reform accelerated, the treasury was brought into order, and a more assertive foreign policy was pursued. For Michael, this was not a moment of being overshadowed, but a moment of profound relief and vindication. The return of his father was the fulfillment of his deepest wish and the final, solidifying piece of the puzzle of state stability. The dynasty was now whole. The government now had a firm, experienced hand at the tiller, and Russia, for the first time since the death of the last Rurikid, had a truly functional and stable center of power. To the modern observer, a young monarch willingly ceding the lion's share of his power to his father might seem a sign of weakness, a moment of personal humiliation. But to understand Michael Romanov, one must enter a different psychological landscape, a world where power was seen not as a personal possession, but as a divine burden. This was the psychology of the Shadow Tsar. Michael's reaction to his father's return was not one of jealousy or resentment, but of sincere joy and relief. This was not a moment of hubris, because Michael possessed none. His entire life had conditioned him to see himself not as a conqueror or a visionary autocrat in the mold of Ivan the Terrible, but as a custodian, a caretaker of a sacred trust. He genuinely believed in the traditional Orthodox concept of symphonia, the harmonious relationship between secular and spiritual authority. In his father, who was both a seasoned politician and the patriarch of the church, this ideal was perfectly embodied. He saw Filaret's assumption of power not as a demotion for himself, but as the restoration of the proper, God-ordained order of things. This allowed Michael to settle into the role for which he was temperamentally far better suited. He could focus on the ceremonial and religious duties of the Tsar, which were of immense importance in a traditional society. He could preside over long church services, lead religious processions, and meet with clerical leaders, reinforcing the image of a pious, God-fearing ruler. This division of labor was incredibly effective. While Filaret engaged in the often brutal and compromising work of daily governance, purging corrupt officials, haggling with foreign envoys, and planning military campaigns, Michael remained above the political fray, his image as a pure and sacred monarch untarnished. He became the symbol of the nation's spiritual revival, while his father was the engine of its political and administrative reconstruction. This psychological acceptance of a secondary role was, paradoxically, one of his greatest strengths. A more ambitious or prideful young ruler might have clashed with his powerful father, creating a new rift at the center of the state. Michael's meekness, his genuine piety, and his deep filial devotion ensured that the diarchy worked, providing Russia with a decade of strong, stable, and unified leadership at the most critical juncture of its recovery. To fully grasp the fragility of Michael's new dynasty, one must look closely at the man who considered it an abomination: King Sigismund III, Vasa of Poland. He was not just a political rival, he was a sworn enemy, an antagonist whose entire worldview was predicated on the illegitimacy of the Romanov regime. This was Sigismund the Zealot. His personal history defined his politics. He was the son of a Swedish king and a Polish princess, and he had briefly been king of both realms before being deposed in Sweden by his Protestant uncle, largely due to his uncompromising Catholicism. This experience left him with a lifelong obsession with reclaiming his Swedish inheritance and a deep-seated hostility towards all forms of religious dissent, whether Protestant or Orthodox. When he looked at Russia, he did not see a fellow Christian kingdom, but a land of schismatics wallowing in error, a prize to be won for the Catholic faith and the Polish Commonwealth. His conviction was absolute. He had invested immense political capital in the Russian adventure, and he could not accept that it had failed. His son, Władysław, had been legally elected Tsar by the Moscow boyars in 1610. In Sigismund's legalistic and dogmatic mind, this oath was eternally binding. The election of Michael Romanov was therefore an act of perjury and rebellion by an ungrateful people. He saw Michael not as a fellow monarch, but as a low-born upstart, the leader of a rogue faction. This personal animosity was intensified by the long imprisonment of Filaret. Holding the father of his rival as a hostage was a major diplomatic weapon, and Sigismund used it to try and destabilize the new Russian government, constantly dangling the prospect of Filaret's release in exchange for impossible concessions. Even after the Truce of Dulino, which officially ended the open war, Sigismund's court continued to support pretenders and dissenters within Russia, and Władysław did not formally renounce his claim to the Russian throne until the Treaty of Polianowka in 1634, after Sigismund's death. This relentless, ideologically driven hostility from the most powerful neighboring state defined the first 2 decades of Michael's reign. It forced Russia to remain on a constant war footing, to pour its scarce resources into Western defenses, and to seek alliances with Poland's other enemies, such as Sweden and the Ottoman Empire. Sigismund's personal vendetta ensured that the Romanovs' first years were not a time of peaceful reconstruction, but a desperate struggle for survival against a foe who denied their very right to exist. While grand politics and military campaigns dominate the chronicles, the true foundation of the Romanov dynasty was laid not on the battlefield, but in the dusty archives of the Kremlin's administrative offices. This was the slow, unglamorous, and absolutely essential masonry of a new realm. The state Michael inherited was not just broken. Its very machinery had been dismantled. The work of his government was akin to reconstructing a complex clock that had been smashed to pieces. The most urgent task was the army. The old system of a gentry militia had proven disastrously ineffective against modern European armies. Under Filaret's direction, the government began the expensive and difficult process of creating regiments of the new order, Polki Novogostroya. These were infantry and cavalry units, organized, trained, and drilled along Western European lines by hired foreign officers, Scots, Germans, Dutch, and Swedes. This was a military revolution in its infancy, laying the groundwork for the powerful army of Peter the Great. Simultaneously, a massive effort was underway to simply make the country habitable again. Dozens of towns that had been sacked and burned during the Troubles were slowly rebuilt, with the state directing resources and manpower to reconstruct fortifications and encourage resettlement. To fund all this, the tax system, the soka, was reformed, with a new census undertaken to identify taxable households and lands with ruthless efficiency, often causing great hardship but ensuring a predictable stream of revenue. The government also understood the importance of commerce. It actively encouraged foreign trade, granting concessions to the English Muscovy Company and fostering links with Persian merchants via the Volga route, seeking new sources of silver and luxury goods. The bureaucracy of the Prikazi swelled, with new departments created to manage the growing complexity of the state. This was painstaking work, a matter of countless decrees, tedious land surveys, and brutal tax collection. It lacked the drama of a coronation or a battle, but it was far more important. It was the slow, methodical process of reweaving the very fabric of a functioning state, creating the administrative skeleton that would support the weight of the future Russian Empire. Beyond the council chambers and battlefields, the survival of the new dynasty depended on a far more intimate and delicate matter: the production of a legitimate heir. This was the story of a bride for the Tsar, a mother for the dynasty. In a hereditary monarchy, an unmarried, childless ruler is a beacon of instability, inviting plots and succession crises. The matter of Michael's marriage was therefore one of the highest affairs of state. The traditional method of selecting a Tsarina was the bride show, a custom of Byzantine origin where hundreds of beautiful daughters of the nobility from across the kingdom were gathered for the Tsar to inspect and choose from. Michael's first choice in 1623 fell upon Maria Klopova, the daughter of a minor nobleman. However, this choice angered the powerful Saltykov boyar clan, who had their own ambitions and were close to Michael's mother, Marfa. In a classic court intrigue, they conspired to have Maria suddenly fall ill, and then convinced the court physicians to declare her barren and unfit to be Tsarina. The heartbroken Michael was forced to discard his chosen bride, who was exiled along with her family. For 2 years, the Tsar remained unmarried, a dangerous situation that fueled court rivalries. Finally, in 1626, another bride show was held. This time, Michael made a shrewder choice, one that seemed designed to avoid empowering any of the great clans. He selected Eudoxia Streshneva, the daughter of an impoverished nobleman from a provincial family. She was beautiful and reputedly gentle, but more importantly, she had no powerful relatives who could dominate the court. This was a politically astute move, signaling a desire to keep the powerful boyar families at arm's length from the throne. Eudoxia proved to be a successful Tsarina, bearing Michael 10 children, though only 4 survived to adulthood. The most important of these was the Tsarevich Alexei, born in 1629. The birth of a healthy male heir was a moment of immense political significance. It secured the succession, dashing the hopes of rival claimants and ensuring that the throne would pass peacefully within the Romanov family. The quiet, domestic success of Michael's marriage was as crucial to the dynasty's long-term survival as any military or administrative reform. It transformed the Romanovs from a single, fragile ruler into a true dynasty with a future. For over a decade, the unique diarchy of son Tsar and father patriarch had provided an unparalleled period of stability and decisive leadership. But this stability rested on the life of one aging man, and his death in October 1633 plunged the court back into the familiar currents of intrigue and uncertainty. This was the moment the patriarch's empty throne cast a long shadow. Filaret had been the true ruler of Russia, the iron hand guiding the state. When he died, Michael Romanov, at the age of 37, was forced to rule alone for the first time in his life. He had been Tsar for 20 years, but he had never been the ultimate authority. The first cracks in the edifice of the state began to appear almost immediately. The powerful boyar clans, long held in check by Filaret's ruthless authority, saw their opportunity. Factions began to form at court, jockeying for influence over the gentle and less politically astute Tsar. The Saltykovs, relatives of Michael's mother, battled with other prominent families for control of key government posts and lucrative appointments. The consensus that had been forged by the diarchy began to fray, replaced by the familiar whispers and conspiracies of the Boyar Duma. This internal instability was compounded by a growing external threat from the south. While the government had been focused on the western frontier with Poland, the Crimean Tatars had continued their devastating raids with impunity. The southern borderlands were a lawless zone of constant, low-level warfare. The Tatars would sweep in, burning villages, seizing crops, and most terrifyingly, capturing thousands of people to be sold into slavery. The defensive lines were inadequate, and the army, focused on European-style warfare, was ill-equipped to counter the lightning-fast tactics of the steppe horsemen. This bleeding ulcer on the southern frontier was a constant drain on the treasury and manpower, a source of profound national shame, and a problem that Filaret's strong hand had managed, but not solved. With his death, the challenge of defending the vast, open steppe fell squarely on Michael's shoulders, at the very moment his own court was dissolving into factionalism. The reassuring stability of the 1620s was over. The era of solitary rule would be defined by new and resurgent dangers. Faced with the intractable problem of the southern steppe and the limitations of his army after the Smolensk disaster, Michael's government embarked on one of the most ambitious and consequential state projects of the 17th century. It was a fateful act that would define Russia's geopolitical identity for a century to come. This was the building of the Great Wall of Muscovy. The decision was an admission of strategic reality. Russia could not project power deep into the wild field to defeat the Crimean Khanate on its own turf. The Ottomans, the Khan's overlords, were too powerful. Therefore, the only viable strategy was a fortified defense in depth. The Belgorod Line was a monumental undertaking, a system of interconnected forts, earthen ramparts, watchtowers, and natural obstacles like rivers and forests, stretching for hundreds of kilometers across the landscape. It was designed not as an impenetrable wall, but as a complex defensive web. Watchtowers would provide early warning of a Tatar raid. The approaching horde would be channeled by the fortifications into designated killing grounds, where mobile detachments of troops stationed in the forts could intercept and attack them. The project required a colossal mobilization of state resources. Tens of thousands of peasants and soldiers were conscripted to fell trees, dig ditches, and raise ramparts under grueling conditions. New towns and fortresses were founded, pushing the effective border of the Russian state steadily southwards. This was more than a military project. It was an act of colonization. As the line was built, the land behind it became safer, attracting settlers who brought the wilderness under the plow, transforming the security frontier into an economic one. This decision had a profound psychological and strategic impact. It represented a turn away from the grand European ambitions that had ended so disastrously at Smolensk. Russia was turning inward and southward, focusing on the slow, grinding, and unglamorous work of securing its continental heartland. It was the strategy of the tortoise, not the hare, a slow but inexorable expansion, consolidating territory, assimilating the frontier, and building a foundation of demographic and agricultural strength. The Belgorod Line was the physical manifestation of Russia's new grand strategy, a defensive, land-based empire focused on securing its borders before dreaming again of foreign conquests. In the year 1637, an unexpected and explosive opportunity arose on the southern frontier, a tempting prize that forced Tsar Michael and his government into an agonizing national debate, culminating in a decision that would be remembered as a moment of both profound wisdom and bitter humiliation. This was the temptation and tragedy of Azov. The Don Cossacks, the fiercely independent and warlike communities living along the Don River, had long been a thorn in the side of both Russia and the Ottoman Empire. In a daring surprise attack, they captured the powerful Ottoman fortress of Azov at the mouth of the Don River, a strategic linchpin that controlled access to the Sea of Azov and served as a major base for Tatar raids. It was a stunning victory. The Cossacks, knowing they could not hold the fortress alone against the inevitable Ottoman counterattack, immediately sent an embassy to Moscow, formally offering the fortress to Tsar Michael, their Orthodox sovereign. The offer threw the Kremlin into turmoil. To accept Azov would be a massive strategic victory. It would give Russia a foothold on a southern sea, curb the power of the Crimean Khanate, and be a glorious triumph for Orthodox Christendom over the infidel. The military and the church were ecstatic, pushing hard for acceptance. However, Michael and his more cautious advisors understood the terrifying implications. Accepting Azov would mean immediate, all-out war with the Ottoman Empire, a global superpower at the height of its strength, possessing a massive army and navy far beyond anything Russia could hope to match. For 5 years, the issue was debated. The government even convened a special Zemsky Sobor in 1642 to discuss the matter. Representatives from all classes of society spoke. The nobles and churchmen spoke of glory and holy duty. The merchants and peasants spoke of the crushing taxes and ruinous levies that a new great war would bring. In the end, pragmatism triumphed over ambition. With the memory of the Smolensk defeat still fresh, the Sobor concluded that the state simply could not afford such a war. The Tsar officially refused the Cossacks' gift. He sent them money and supplies, but ordered them to abandon the fortress. The Cossacks, after a heroic 5-year defense, had no choice but to comply. The decision was undoubtedly correct from a strategic standpoint. It saved Russia from a potentially annihilating conflict. But it was also perceived as a national disgrace, a moment when the Tsar had shown weakness and failed in his duty to defend the Orthodox faith and expand the realm. The final decade of Michael Romanov's life was not marked by dramatic events, but by a slow, inexorable physical decline, a fading of the founder that mirrored the settling of the state into a new, more stable, but also more rigid form. Having weathered the storms of foreign invasion, internal rebellion, and court intrigue, the Tsar's body began to fail him. He was plagued by what contemporary sources describe as scurvy and dropsy, edema, which left him in constant pain and made movement difficult. He had always been of a gentle, retiring disposition, and as his illness worsened, he withdrew further from the day-to-day business of governance. The reins of power, once held firmly by his father Filaret, now fell into the hands of competing boyar factions. Powerful figures like Prince Ivan Cherkassky and Boyar Fyodor Sheremetev, men who had been with him since the beginning, became the de facto rulers, managing the prikazi and making key decisions. The court became a nest of intrigue, as it had been before Filaret's return, but with a crucial difference. The ultimate authority of the Tsar and the legitimacy of his dynasty were no longer in question. Michael's final and perhaps most important political act was to ensure this stability would outlive him. He meticulously prepared his son, the Tsarevich Alexei, for the throne. Alexei was given a progressive education by his tutor, the boyar Boris Morozov, learning not only traditional religious texts, but also being exposed to Western ideas and languages. Michael ensured that all the key figures at court and in the army swore allegiance not just to him, but to his designated heir. His overriding goal was to prevent the nightmare scenario, a succession crisis that could unravel all the painful progress that had been made over the past 30 years. He was determined that his death would not trigger a new time of troubles. In this, he was entirely successful. His slow decline gave the political elite time to adjust to the reality of the coming succession, allowing for a smooth and orderly transition of power. The founder was fading away, but the foundation he had laid proved to be solid. The end came not in the chaos of battle or at the hand of an assassin, but quietly, on a warm summer day, surrounded by the rituals of his faith and the security of his established dynasty. This was the hero's finale. On the 12th of July, 1645, his 49th birthday, and name day, Tsar Michael I Romanov died in his chambers in the Moscow Kremlin. In his final hours, he performed the last great duty of a sovereign. He summoned his 16-year-old son, Alexei, to his bedside. Before the assembled boyars of the Duma and the highest clergy, he formally blessed his son with the icons, passing the scepter of the kingdom to him. He charged his leading advisors to serve his son as faithfully as they had served him, securing their oaths of allegiance to the new Tsar. The transfer of power, the single most dangerous moment in any autocracy, was seamless. There were no competing claimants, no boyar conspiracies, no military revolts. The throne passed from father to son as peacefully and naturally as if the Romanovs had been ruling for centuries. The irony of his death was profound. The man who had been called to the throne as a terrified 16-year-old, a sacrificial lamb in a time of chaos, now died peacefully in his bed, leaving that same throne to his own 16-year-old son, not as a poisoned chalice, but as the secure inheritance of a stable and functioning state. His greatest achievement was not a conquest or a grand reform, but the simple fact of this peaceful end. He had taken a crown of thorns and transformed it into a legacy of legitimacy. The bells of Moscow that tolled for his death were not ringing in a new era of uncertainty, but were marking the end of the first chapter in the long history of a dynasty that was now, finally, secure. The quiet boy had fulfilled his terrifying duty. For centuries after his death, the legacy of Michael Romanov remained a subject of intense debate, a conflict of interpretations where his image was constantly reshaped to fit the needs of the present. Was he a puppet, a saint, or a pragmatist? In the official historiography of the Russian Empire, particularly during the tercentenary celebrations in 1913, he was lionized as the founder, the meekest Tsar, a pious and gentle ruler chosen by God and the people to heal the wounds of the nation. He was portrayed as a symbol of national unity and humble devotion, the ideal patriarch for a new era. In this monarchist narrative, his weakness was transformed into a virtue, a sign of his Christian humility and his reliance on the collective will of his subjects. In contrast, 19th century liberal and radical historians took a far more critical view. They saw him as a complete non-entity, a weak-willed and unremarkable figure who was a mere puppet in the hands of more powerful actors. In this interpretation, the real rulers were his mother, Marfa, the powerful boyar clans, and above all, his dominant father, Patriarch Filaret. For these historians, Michael's reign was significant only for the strengthening of serfdom and the entrenchment of a reactionary autocracy. Soviet historians largely followed this line, dismissing him as a tool of the feudal landlord class and focusing on the peasant uprisings and social oppression that marked his time. It is only in more recent, post-Soviet historiography that a more nuanced and complex portrait has emerged. Modern historians tend to see him as a crucial transitional figure, a pragmatist whose very lack of aggressive ambition was precisely what the shattered country needed. They argue that his willingness to rule by consensus through the Zemsky Sobor in his early years and his later peaceful co-rule with his father were not signs of weakness, but acts of profound political wisdom. He is now often seen as the indispensable quiet center, the keystone in the arch that allowed the broken pieces of the Russian state to be reassembled. This modern view recognizes that he was not a great conqueror or a visionary reformer, but something perhaps more important. He was the healer. So we return to the central dramatic paradox. How did the weak boy succeed where so many strong men had failed? The final answer lies in the profound and paradoxical nature of powerful weakness. Michael Romanov did not save Russia in spite of his weakness. He saved it because of his weakness. To understand this, one must understand the political landscape of 1613. The country was not looking for a new Ivan the Terrible. It was terrified of one. The great boyar clans had destroyed each other in their quest for supreme power. Any candidate from their ranks, a Schwisky, a Golitsyn, a Mstislavsky, would have been immediately opposed by all the others, sparking a new round of civil war. A strong, proven military leader would have been a threat to the established aristocracy. Michael, in his youth, piety, and political innocence, threatened no one. He was the perfect blank slate upon which all factions could project their hopes. His lack of a political past meant he was untainted by the bloody sins of the time of troubles. His connection to the old dynasty, however tenuous, provided a vital thread of legitimacy that no other candidate possessed. His well-known piety resonated deeply with the spiritual mood of the country, which saw the smuta as a divine punishment and believed that only a return to orthodoxy and tradition could bring salvation. He was, in essence, the ultimate compromise. He did not seize power. He was called to it. He did not impose his will upon the system. He allowed the system to reform itself around him as its symbolic center. The true savior of Russia, therefore, was not a single man, but the collective will of a political nation that had stared into the abyss and collectively decided to pull back. They needed a symbol to rally around, a legitimate, God-anointed figure to end the chaos of pretenders and warlords. Michael Romanov was the only figure who could fit that symbolic role without simultaneously being a political threat to the powerful factions whose cooperation was necessary for survival. He was the keystone in the arch, by himself just a stone, but his position and shape allowed all the other stones to lock into place and bear weight once more. The final verdict of history on the reign of Michael Romanov is not a tale of heroic genius, but a profound lesson on the nature of recovery from civilizational collapse. His life demonstrates that the path out of anarchy is not always forged by an iron will or a brilliant military mind. Sometimes it is paved with patience, compromise, and the slow, agonizing, and unglamorous work of rebuilding institutions. This is the lesson of the quiet center. Michael's reign stands as a testament to the idea that, in a society torn apart by factionalism, a leader who can serve as a point of consensus, however passive, can be more effective than a dictator who rules by force. His reliance on the Zemsky Sobor in the early years was not a democratic ideal, but a pragmatic necessity that forced the warring elites of Russia to talk to each other and share responsibility for the fate of the nation. It rebuilt a shattered social contract from the ground up. His story is also a powerful illustration of how legitimacy can be a more potent weapon than a sword. Surrounded by enemies and with a broken army, his only true asset was his status as the lawfully elected, God-anointed Tsar. This status alone was enough to make the rebellions of pretenders and warlords seem like banditry rather than legitimate political challenges. He re-established the sacred aura of the monarchy, which had been destroyed during the Smuda. The universal lesson of his life is about the different forms that strength can take. There is the strength of the storm that breaks the trees, and there is the strength of the sapling that bends in the wind and survives. Michael Romanov was the sapling. He did not conquer the chaos, he outlasted it, providing the quiet, stable center around which the forest could slowly, painstakingly regrow. The final frame is not the gilded splendor of a St. Petersburg palace or the blood-soaked field of a great battle. We return to the beginning. The camera pulls back, leaving the Kremlin behind, flying over the forests and fields of Russia, back to the quiet provincial town of Kostroma. We settle on the humble, whitewashed stone walls of the Ipatiev monastery, gleaming in the morning light, its golden domes reflected in the calm waters of the river. This is the cradle. This is the place where a terrified boy wept and prayed, refusing a crown. This is where the desperate plea of a dying nation was answered, not with a hero, but with a symbol of hope. From this quiet sanctuary, a dynasty was born that would last for 309 years. It would produce Peter the Great and Catherine the Great. It would expand its dominion across 1/6 of the Earth's landmass. It would build a magnificent empire, and it would ultimately collapse in a new and even more terrible time of troubles. But all of that future, all of that unimaginable glory and tragedy is contained in this one simple image. The long shadow of the monastery bell tower stretches out, and in that shadow, we see the entire story of Russia. A story of chaos and order, of faith and despair, of weakness becoming the most unexpected and enduring form of strength. The flame was not rekindled by a mighty roar, but by a quiet prayer whispered within these very walls.